It feels a little weird to have two Left 4 Dead inspired games developed by different ex-members of the original Left 4 Dead team released within the same 4-month window, and yet, here we are, with Back 4 Blood basically closing out last year, and the Anacrusis here to kick off the new year. While Back 4 Blood had quite the active marketing campaign, courtesy of the abundant resources of its publisher, WB Games, the Anacrusis comparatively has flown under the radar, with only a small number of content creators and websites really staying on top of it as a potentially interesting title. Well, it's out now on Steam, so I decided to do what I do best and take a look at it for you guys. For those of you that haven't been closely following the Anacrusis, it's a cooperative multiplayer first-person shooter game which features a very vivid cartoony art style with sci-fi aesthetics, and is, quoting the Steam description, set aboard a massive starship stranded at the edge of space. Team up with your friends in a infinitely replayable fight against alien hordes to unlock perks, weapons, and new ways to play that you can share with your team. I'm going to cut to the chase a bit prematurely here by pointing out the obvious. This game may have been designed to be infinitely replayable, but nothing in its current state actually makes me want to do so. One of the much discussed new mechanics being introduced here in the Anacrusis is the matter compilers you'll find randomly across the levels. These operate essentially as upgrade stations for your weapons. For example, for my shotgun, I got 2 upgrades, one that increased my maximum clip and ammo carry size, and a second one later on that allowed my shots to penetrate more than one target at a time, if I was in a position where I could line them up properly. You do oftentimes have to really explore in order to find these matter compilers, because they tend to be tucked in a corner out of the way. Although there were some playthroughs that I had where we looked exhaustively through every room and corridor to find one, and we just never found it. So part of me wonders if it's not necessarily guaranteed that one will appear, at least in the current early access build. Since we're on the subject of weapon upgrades, let's talk about the weapons themselves, shall we? The current variety of weapon selection is definitely extremely limited. You have a meager handful of primary weapon types, being namely an SMG, as well as a semi-auto and a shotgun, with a pistol being the default secondary weapon. I haven't seen anything resembling a melee weapon in the game as of now. I can't definitively say it doesn't exist, as the weapon placement and many of the other gameplay elements appear to be randomly decided by the AI director, but in the almost 2 hours I've spent playing and replaying these levels, I've yet to spot a single one. While the overall mediocre weapon variety and limited access to upgrades both collectively don't do the Anacrusis any favors, it's the weapon animation and sound effect quality where the game really goes off the rails. Weapons, simply put, don't ever feel impactful. And I know some might say, well, these weapons are sci-fi, so that's to be expected, right? To anyone potentially using that as a defense, I have to ask, have you ever sat down and watched a Star Wars movie before? Say what you will about the overall quality of certain individual films, because that's certainly up for debate, but one of the things Star Wars has almost always gotten right was putting in sound effects that simultaneously managed to sound both futuristic and also very meaty. When 2 lightsabers clash, you hear the impact. When the X-Wings are going in to bombard the Death Star, their lasers have much more audio impact than a hand blaster would. All of the weapons sound proportional to their intended use. Here the weapons sound very floaty, very much reminiscent of your typical pew-pew royalty-free sound effect. The problem with being stylistic with your sound effects is that you have to constantly keep hold of these 2 mandates if you want your game or film, or what have you, to stand out from the rest. Number 1, the sound effects have to loosely adhere to the genre expectations of the game or film you're contributing the sound effects towards, while also adding your own unique individuality, your own spin into the mix. Number 2, at the same time, each weapon or other object requiring post-production sound effects needs to clearly audibly stand out from each other, so precisely that even a blind person could listen to gameplay of your game or a scene from your film and be able to instantly distinguish one weapon or object from the other because of the differing sounds. This may sound like a trivial nitpick here, but trust me, you'll recognize when a game has bad audio design, even unconsciously. If it sounds too generic or too cliché, you won't likely be going out of your way to replay the game as often, because it's one of those factors that, when combined with others, is what often leads people to stop playing a game or replaying a game. A weapon has to not only look good, but also feel good. And when it comes to games, the sound design plays a moderately noteworthy factor in how good a weapon feels to play. But of course, the biggest factor is how the weapon fires, from the weapon animations to the hit registration to the ranged damage fall-off rates, etc. To start off with the weapon animations, they're not dreadful, but they definitely don't have that good, responsive, snappy feel that the best FPS games out there all have. Also, they all tend to be rather slow, which I feel was an intended design choice, although in my opinion it was a pretty dumb one. If you're going to emulate Left 4 Dead while still introducing your own unique flavor to it, slowing everything down to the speed of molasses isn't exactly the type of new spin I would recommend adding to the mix. Speaking of which, let's briefly segue into your mobility options here in game. Don't worry, this won't take long because there really aren't that many. As far as I can tell, sprinting is not an option at any point in the game. I know I've tried to sprint on my end. I've watched other Let's Plays and live streams to confirm this, and yeah, the developers appear to have not added sprinting to the game for some strange reason. I don't know how you can call yourself a first-person shooter while actively disabling any form of sprinting. At the very least, add a limited time sprint with a hefty stamina cooldown so players can at least run up and down a hallway without having to stop and catch their breath. Weirdly enough, the developers did add jumping as a mechanic, which honestly is the bare minimum you should have in an FPS, but unless your foot is getting glitched into the floor or stuck on an object protruding out of the ground, you're almost never going to use the jump unless you're honestly bored and just want to do a bit of old-fashioned bunny hopping. Let's talk about the enemy types. As was the case with Left 4 Dead, you have two main groups of enemies, the first being the common infected with your typical low-health, fast-moving zombies, and the special infected, aka the buggers that are designed from the ground up to give you and your team a bit of a hard time. At least in theory. I think here they might call these guys something other than common and special infected, but honestly at the end of the day I couldn't care less about the proper naming of these beasties, and neither will you, as most of the time they have about as much personality as a discarded condom wrapper. You can easily tell which are the common infected because they all look like the human minions of that giant starfish from the recent Suicide Squad movie, with all the stupid little mini starfishies stapled to their heads like Half-Life's head crabs. The special infected are really easy to spot because they all move about and attack in unique ways with distinctive models that will help you visually tell them apart from the usual grunts. I recall fighting against a steroid-ridden melee guy that kept trying to Hulk smash us to death, functionally quite similar to the tank from Left 4 Dead 2. We ran into him quite a few times. Then you have these weird sea urchin looking enemies that kind of bounce around or hop around in a seemingly low gravity mode. But easily the most annoying special infected I had to deal with was this one special infected whose name I don't recall and I don't care, who would keep flashbanging you with possibly the most blinding sunlight I've ever seen in a game. I don't have a problem with blinding the character, but I do draw the line at blinding the player in real life with your glaring sunlight. It's so bad that you literally cannot see where the guy causing it is because the sunlight is both so glaring and so evenly dispersed that you can't clearly identify any shadows or walls beyond your immediate range, making it effectively impossible for you to take out the enemy causing it, unless you and your team just spray automatic fire in its general direction until you hit it and it dies. Luckily it dies almost instantly a single bullet hits it, so at least you and your team won't have to have a lengthy battle. One of the key defining characteristics in a good Left 4 Dead style co-op FPS game is the personalities of the individual characters that make up the game's cast, as well as both the scripted and more spontaneous interactions between certain characters over the course of the campaign. Ideally, like I already outlined with the sound effects, each character should have their own unique personality that stands out on their own, while also blending in well with the other characters on the team. However, from the very first moment we're introduced to these babbling, bumbling band of baboons, you can just tell this won't be the case. The in-game rendered intro cutscene lasts all of like 5 seconds, and tells you basically nothing you didn't already know. And throughout the levels, the characters more or less are silent mutes that only communicate with each other via specific hazard or enemy-specific callouts, like screaming for help when their character is downed or announcing that a special infected enemy type has been spotted nearby. Honestly, if I was the one calling the shots at this point, I would just scrap the current intro cutscene mechanic, or whatever you'd call that quick transition at the start. It does nothing. Either rework it to actually include some dialogue and, lore material, while also adding in way more interactions during the level itself, or don't bother even pretending you're going to have anything resembling character interaction in the first place. It's a bad idea to tease and never deliver. When you take all these aforementioned factors into consideration, and then step back to look at the gameplay in general, can you honestly tell me this game is really riveting in any way? I'm going to put the controls in your hands for a moment and you tell me. I'm going to roll 30 seconds of unedited gameplay of me making my way through a single quarter in the game, your typical run-of-the-mill gameplay, just to give you an idea of how the levels lay out, before we move on to stuff like the game's performance and my final thoughts. And you can tell me if you found yourself captivated by the gameplay here.
That's better.
Stay together down here.
I mean, it's not the worst gameplay I have ever experienced, far from, but it's so lifeless and devoid of fun, while at the same time, the aesthetic tries to go completely the opposite direction and have this colorful, flamboyant disco party feel, that the difference between what the game thinks it is versus what it actually is made crystal clear to the player. I'm also a little concerned at the lack of an overall roadmap as far as future content plans go. I know the developers intend on adding some kind of free season pass system to the game, which they hope will provide the incentivization needed to ensure the player base sticks around long term, replaying levels over and over and over again to grind their way up through the season pass. But given how the season pass isn't here right now on day one, I have to wonder whether the majority of the player base will even care when it does get added at some point. Moving on though, the optimization here in the Anacrusis is surprisingly quite good actually. Early access games historically tend to be rather hit or miss when it comes to optimization, since usually most of the developers choose to, in the early days, prioritize the addition of new gameplay content over refining and polishing that which has already been added to the game. The Anacrusis, however, solves this problem by introducing very little content, but ensuring said content runs just fine on most higher mid-range gaming PCs. While I'm on the subject of options, you do have a couple of useful social options, namely the ability to hide your lobby invite code, which I imagine might be useful to streamers and content creators, and the ability to mute your teammates. However, you are inexplicably missing one very crucial gameplay option, being the option to vote kick or report a player. I have no idea why this wasn't added, since player reporting has been around for a very long time and isn't honestly that hard to add to a game. But here we are. That said, all of these issues pale in comparison to the biggest issue of all, and all things related to the Anacrusis, is there simply isn't enough content to justify the price, and even if the developers were to add in the 2 remaining episodes that are currently locked off and are planned to be dispensed out in future major updates sometime later this year, you're still looking at a pitiful amount of content overall for what is a $29.99 game. I myself had complaints about Back 4 Blood slicing off content for future updates and expansions, but at least Back 4 Blood had 20 plus levels in total, which isn't a bad bargain for a $60 AAA game. When you divide it up, you're basically paying $3 a level, which overall isn't a bad value proposition. Here with the Anacrusis, you have a total of 3 levels. And they expect Valve fanboys who were disappointed with Back 4 Blood and are looking for that one true Left 4 Dead successor to pay $30 for this game, which currently works out to be $10 a level. Even when you add in the other 2 levels to bring the total up to 5 levels, that's still $6 a level, which is astronomically high when you consider how relatively short these individual levels are. You can play through this entire game in easily less than an hour. I did. I played through the entire game in like 50 minutes. And while again the game is clearly designed with replay value in mind, you do have to have at least a certain amount of content for people to replay without the amount being so little that the relative tedium of replaying the same levels again and again and again ad nauseum begins to drown out any secondary incentives the developers may add to the game later on. And what little you can play here is of such dismal quality that it would require an enormous undertaking to transform it into anything resembling a decent quality co-op FPS, let alone one attempting to capitalize on the appeal of older, honestly better made games. At the end of the day, if you're wondering whether the Anacrusis is worth buying, I mean, if you couldn't figure it out from my tone already, my answer right now would be absolutely positively not. I actually personally went so far as to apply for a refund via Steam, and given Steam's usual refund processing time, I should hopefully get my money back sometime between now and when Half-Life 3 releases into early access in 2045. And as anyone who knows me can attest, a game has to be pretty bad for me to go through with actually refunding it. I subscribe to the philosophy that many games are just so bad that they're kind of good, so I end up enjoying a lot of games that a lot of other people online hate. But the problem is, this game isn't really horrible, it's not bad, it's just boring. There's nothing about it that hooks me in. Hopefully over time that'll change in a year from now when it exits out of early access. The Anacrusis will miraculously pull off an incredible 180-degree turn and turn itself into being Game of the Year material. We need more good Left 4 Dead type co-op games on the market, but right now, the Anacrusis just isn't one of them. On that note, that's where I think I'm going to wrap it up for today. You know the drill. Liking the video is always appreciated, and for those of you new to the channel, I post new review videos once a week here, sometimes once every 2 weeks, in addition to other gaming content. If you want to support the work I do, subscribing and clicking the bell to opt into getting notifications does help. This is Warrior Dan signing out. Stay awesome everybody, stay safe, and peace out.